I hand it off to Glenn and Kathryn.
I'm going to go to screen share here while Kathy speaks a little bit.
Okay, so thank you so much to Watsonville Wetlands Watch for having us tonight. We're so excited to be here. So this book, you know, this is all history that happened when Glenn and I were basically in kindergarten. I grew up in Santa Cruz, and of course he grew up here in North Monterey County, and you know, and neither of us have any memory at all of these events as they happened. But you know, the one thing that we do remember from our childhood very vividly is the PG&E stacks and the, you know, the gray or brown clouds that would sometimes pour out of them into the sky. And you know, and I remember seeing that kind of brown line in the upper atmosphere, which was you know, the sign of the inversion layer and the pollutants that were getting trapped underneath. Now we don't see that anymore, or if we do, it's an extremely rare occasion, and that's because we have great environmental protection regulations now that make sure we have clean air and clean water and you know, all those things that make this such a wonderful environment. And so, you know, part of what we are capturing in the book is this real evolution of thought among people who, because there really was not a strong environmental movement at this time in the mid-60s when the Humboldt Oil Project was proposed. It wasn't like it is now, where we pretty much automatically think about, well, what's the impact on the environment? This was a time when people were still considering business to be the kind of the primary consideration. Anyway, but we'll get into all that. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Glenn Church, my husband and co-author.
Thanks, Kathy. So the important thing to realize about the whole Humboldt oil controversy is that it's a lot more than just an oil refinery that was going to go into Moss Landing. At the time it was coming, this was 1965, or that it was, you know, that Humboldt Oil proposed to build it. It was going to kickstart what was called the Moss Landing Area Development Plan. This was a plan that was going to cover 60 square miles from basically Casterville to Pajaro, and then inland all the way to San Miguel Canyon Road and Highway 101. Massive amount of a development, and thousands and thousands of acres of heavy industry were planned into this. It was going to be something that would just, if it would have come to be, Humboldt Oil would have kickstarted that whole plan, and it just would have changed the whole look and feel of the Monterey Bay area. Everything we've come to cherish here, from the fine agriculture, you know, the great, you know, the great spots of that bring tourists into here, and the natural beauty. The Elkhorn Slough would have been totally destroyed. You have to, you know, question whether the Monterey Bay Aquarium would have ever been started, and the whole Monterey Bay would have been set aside and protected is up in the air as well. They're just the change it would have been is just almost incomprehensible for this day. And yet, this was a story that was really more than just about what was happening here in the Monterey Bay area. This was an issue that gained significant statewide attention. It spilled from 65 into 66, which was an election year for governor, and you had statewide candidates like Ronald Reagan and Alan Cranston who came down into the Monterey Bay area and that were drawn into this. There was considerable media coverage up from San Francisco to Los Angeles on what was being proposed here. And yet it's even more than that, because this actually became a national issue. The New York Times did several newspaper articles on the whole Humboldt controversy in Moss Landing. And why? Because the Humboldt Oil controversy, which has been largely forgotten, was actually one of the very first environmental battles of modern times, and it happened right here. And that in itself is very, very significant. The other thing to really look at this isn't one of these what if scenarios, which we can look at on a lot of different things. This is really a what was, because the surprising fact about it is Humboldt Oil got its permit to build, but it did not. And for a long time, no one really knew why it didn't build. There was some opposition on Monterey Peninsula from it. There was also a lot of opposition up in Santa Cruz, the city of Santa Cruz, while areas between Watsonville and Salinas were very, very strongly in favor of it. So it just sort of disappeared. Nobody really knew what happened. We did some research on this and feel we have defined exactly what happened. And one of the great resources we had out of this was actually my father, Warren Church, who was a Monterey County supervisor at the time. He was elected in 1964 and defeated one of the prime architects of the Moss Landing Area Development Plan. He took office along with one other supervisor in January of 1965. And a month later, in February of 65, Humboldt Oil came in with its proposal. And I had many, many discussions with him. He was in a real predicament himself, as was some other supervisors on an issue like this. But I had many discussions with him over the years. And then when he passed away in 2017, we were going through his many files, and he liked to keep files on pretty much everything. And we had he had his notes, which were probably 3 or 4, yeah, a good 3 inches thick of information that covered both sides of the issue back then. This was just a treasure trove. He had his notes on his thought processes, and I got to say, what I read in there was more detailed and was much better than what he told me, because he had forgotten a lot. So this became a real good starting point. And then the other advantage we had is that we were able to track down the 2 reporters for the Monterey Herald and the Salinas Californian who covered this, and I spent months sending emails back and forth with them, getting their insight. I'd pull up articles that we find from around the area and get the articles they had written, and it would stimulate their memory and it'd give us insight. And so we had this information we felt really had to get out there and present it.
Glenn?
And that's where the story of this book really comes from.
Wonderful, Glenn. I just had a quick question. I'm not familiar with the Humboldt, this project that you keep referring to, or some just the basic context. Would you be able to, and I think you were going right there, right when I interrupted, so apologies if you were, but would you be able to provide just kind of a general backdrop of what was happening? And you've done a great job of saying what was at stake, but what exactly was this proposal, and what did they want to do? What's just
that's
who, what, when, and where of the issue.
Just getting into it. Yeah, yeah, no problem. So it's you can see here a picture of the Moss Landing area here, and with the famous old PG&E smokestacks up there. And if you really look at this whole issue here of what was going on for the Moss Landing Area Development Plan to the Humboldt Oil controversy, it really starts back. You're going straight back to the 1930s when Cannery Row was going over in the Monterey Peninsula, and Moss Landing itself actually had some sardine canneries out on what's called the island, where you see Bill's Fish Market and elsewhere out there. And in World War II came around, and if you look over at Fremont's Peak, there's this dolomite quarry we're all familiar with, and Henry Kaiser started that, and he also started the factory that is now more just a cannabis grow house next to the old PG&E plant, and made munitions out of the products from the quarry. And that helped kind of jumpstart the whole industrialization there of Moss Landing, and PG&E would come in a few years later, right after World War II, and establish its plant. So you had these two kind of coming up there, and the reason they were very appealing, of course, is you had this waterway, the Elkhorn Slough, but you also had that great Monterey submarine canyon, which the thing about it that attracted a lot of industry in is it's an exceptional deep water port, just a few hundred yards from shore. And companies like Humble saw this as an opportunity to bring in super tankers, and they would be able to put in a submarine pipeline, and it would load and unload petroleum byproducts in the from the refinery to the ocean. And what I'm going to have to do here is I'm going to have Kathy read a little bit about the Moss Landing Area Development Plan.
Yeah. I think, though, what Ileana was saying was she wants to know exactly what what the proposal was.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I can get into the proposal. I'll just try to, without jumping past the Moss Landing Area Development Plan, which I think is really extremely important in all this whole thing, is that the Humble oil refinery proposal was to develop a refinery, and they had 444 acres. This 444 acres, they initially planned about a 50,000 barrel a day refinery. That refinery was only going to cover about a third to a quarter of the land, so they had plans to actually establish up to 150, 200,000 barrel a day refinery out of it, is what the initial plan was. And I don't know if that you want to add any more to that, Dan?
Yeah. So in 1965, it was announced that Humble wanted to build on this piece of property, and they sought a permit to build from the Monterey County Board of Supervisors. And so, what the book is mostly about is this 15-month period between that point and when we won't get ahead of ourselves. Anyway, so this massive refinery was proposed to build, and most people were totally for it. And so that was, much different from the attitudes that exist today. Anyway, but backing up, so the reason why Humble wanted to build here is this area had long been planned as an industrial area. And so I'm going to read from our book, Chapter 8, which tells a little bit about this. By the 1950s, the Moss Landing Harbor Commission asked the county for a master plan for the development of Moss Landing. On September 18, 1956, the Monterey County Board of Supervisors approved a massive area development plan that placed Moss Landing as the center of a new industrial economy to supplement tourism and agriculture. With areas zoned for industrial, recreational, residential, and commercial development, the plan promised something for everyone. It encompassed 60 square miles from Watsonville to Castroville and from the Pacific Ocean to Highway 101. The current Highway 1 was to be turned into a frontage road with its bridge removed. A relocated Highway 1 would run to the east, crossing over the slough approximately 1.5 miles to the east of the old Highway 1 bridge, and then merge into Castroville. The new bridge would be a 60-foot high span, so ocean-going ships could navigate deep into the slough. To the east of the slough, a new major road would replace much of winding Elkhorn Road. It would serve the industrial areas planned along the railroad tracks that extended from Moss Landing to Castroville. To the west, a new scenic road would hug the coast all the way to the Salinas River. Past the planned industry along the slough banks as the slough winds toward Pajaro were plans for recreational and urban development with residential zoning to the east. To the northwest, a large recreational lagoon fed by a channel from Moss Landing Harbor and another from the mouth of the Pajaro River would extend inland for about 1 mile at Smodowski Beach. Another industrial zone was planned for the Pajaro area. The Planning Commission assured the county that the master plan was the result of a long process, not hastily drawn, with ample community input and widespread support. The report stated, at the public hearings held by the commission, no opposition was expressed, indicating the results of a careful program of explaining and informing all industry interested groups, organizations, or individuals who were interested to the extent of taking the necessary time and effort to study the plan. Calling for the great potential of the Moss Landing area to be realized, the report explained how it broadened its area to go much beyond Moss Landing. As the study progressed, it became increasingly evident that the study area should be enlarged to encompass a broader area, that to prepare a comprehensive long-term general plan, the impact of industrialization upon the surrounding area should be considered, analyzed, and fit into the pattern of future overall development.
So here is the sort of introductory page on the 1956 Moss Landing Area Development Plan from the Monterey County Planning Commission. And as Kathy stated, nobody opposed this. And this was not a hastily drawn document. It was 3 years in the making. You can see down here on the map, you can see the area it was going to cover. And when it came out, there were people who went forth and immediately said, wow, this is such a great idea. Let's expand it to 200 square miles, which would be the entire North Monterey County area from Salinas northward. There were people on the Monterey Peninsula who were strongly advocating this, because Monterey Peninsula at that time was starting to shift from its canneries to trying to draw in tourism and commercialize Cannery Row. And there were, one of the phrases that was used was, Monterey can be a place for people to play, and Moss Landing a place for them to work. And there were those who said Moss Landing had potential to be even a greater port than Los Angeles. So there were big plans planned here, and this was 1956. Here is a Watsonville Register of Parliamentarian paper that came out announcing this with this bold new future here. Interesting things I learned out from this article was that you got to realize at that time, I'm sure Santa Cruz County was going through the same kind of growth, but Monterey County was growing sometimes at 5% a year in growth, population growth. The demand for infrastructure was tremendous. It was creating lots of property taxes. A lot of people in agriculture were saying, oh, this is a great idea because it'll keep our property taxes lower and we can continue to farm if we have this industry. The two dams in southern Monterey County, Nacimiento and San Antonio, were built at that time. So you can just see there's just a lot of building going on and development. And that is really the great impetus for all of this. Here is the Moss Landing Area Development Plan. I had colorized it as, and just to hit a few points out of here. The red areas are areas that were designed for heavy industry. You can see right over here outside of Watsonville, it was even on Pajaro, it was developed up. The brown areas, the light brown are where the current urban areas in Castroville and Pajaro, and the dark brown is where it was planned for those cities to grow. Castroville is obviously intended to be a much bigger city. The few interesting things is that you'll see this, there's a line here, going across over the slough right and cutting right through the red industrial zoning there. That was going to be the new Highway 1 with the bridge down, as Kathy mentioned, with a 60-foot high span going over the slough, so those ocean-going ships could go in there. Actually, that development was already started by the time 1965 came along. If where you go up Highway 1 and it cuts from 4 lanes to 2. There apparently had been some expansion up there, and that plan was then at that point that it was going to take that next 4 lanes and run it right across there near where the Pajaro Valley Golf Course is up into there. You can see Smedowski Beach down here in the pink. There's a big lagoon going in, which is going to be a big recreational area. So they're just these massive, great, I wouldn't say great, but they had these massive plans for doing things. So up comes along as we're from 56 to 1965.
Glenn,
what happens?
If you have a moment, we had a question from someone named Scott. They wanted to know.
Sure. Go right ahead.
This was before you showed the maps, but I'm wondering, are these maps publicly available anywhere if someone would like to take a closer look?
Well, I'll tell you, on that map here, on this map, this is one of the last things we found. I was looking all around for this map. I couldn't find it. Finally, I contacted Mark Silverstein at the Elkhorn Slough Foundation. I said, Mark, he knew I was writing this, and I said, I can't find anything on this Moss Landing Area Development Plan. And he goes, oh, I got it. And 2 days later, he sent it to me. So it's It's not too available.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing it with us. It really helps clarify what area you're talking about. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Yeah, and we do have this map in our book.
Yeah.
So
It's not colorized, but is it on our website colorized?
I don't know. It's colorized in the ebook version.
Oh, it's colorized in the ebook version. Yes.
Yeah.
So anyway, it comes along. What happens? This starts to change things here because you have this unanimous support for this proposal. Of course, there's 1962 with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which really gave birth to the environmental movement. But in 1963, in New York on the Hudson River, Con Edison wanted to build a power plant into what is known as this Storm King Mountain. The locals there rose up, and really the first battle to oppose industrialization of success, and they would continue on for a 17-year legal battle. It would set Storm King Mountain set the groundwork for environmental law. Actually, one of the first rulings would happen in December '65 as the Humble Oil issue was still playing out, and there was actually a legal battle had been just initiated a month or two earlier against Humble Oil by residents in Monterey County. So I think this was pretty much very strongly on the mind of Humble Oil as it was proceeding. So let's just take a little look at Humble Oil. They had a slogan back in the 60s, put a tiger in your tank, and you could even get these little tiger tails, put them on the back of your car, and I'm sure they littered a lot of highways around with them. Humble Oil at that time, it had Esso and Inco as subsidiaries, and it was actually the biggest oil producer in the United States. Here you can see also a February 1962 Life magazine ad where they're bragging about how much energy they produce and melting all these glaciers, which don't.
They're not bragging about that.
Yeah, they're bragging about that anymore, and I'm this is another piece of evidence that they had an idea that they were actually having an impact on climate. But a few years later, Humble was to change its name to something that's more familiar now, Exxon. So this was no little humble small company. This was a big giant that was coming in. So we get into the real gist of this. This is a newspaper article from the state of California in February 15th, I believe it is, 1965. Humble announces that they want to build. If you look out here, you can see the Moss Landing area. As Humble Oil over here wanted to build its site. You can also see the whole area they purchased up here in the California article is in dark. And then down here they have their initial 50,000 barrel refinery, which is, as they said, plenty of room for expansion. One of the other important things to realize at this time is that PG&E had big plans too. Actually, PG&E had plans to put a nuclear power plant right across Highway 1 from where Humble Oil is, and the whole fact of it is that PG&E was actually talking about putting 3 nuclear power plants in the Moss Landing by 1980. Of course, none of that happened. And if you look over here at PG&E, you can see the picture of it up there. It doesn't look very. The PG&E power plant doesn't look very big. That's because those 2 big stacks that were there, 500 feet tall, were not built. Amazingly, these 2 stacks that we look at and see and define the much of the Monterey Bay area, they were built when this Humble controversy was coming to a head in August and in September of 1965. They started to build these things, and it had to be a vision for everybody from Santa Cruz to Monterey to see. As Humble is coming to a decision, they're seeing the industrialization going forth right before their eyes. So when Humble was coming into here, it also wanted, as I said, I mentioned earlier about the deep water port it wanted, and what they had plans is to run the submarine pipeline out there, and then they had the railroad next to them, and they just felt this was going to be next to a highway. They had all distribution means that they could utilize out of here. So Humble also did a survey of Monterey County, and actually the 5 areas, North County, Salinas, South County, Seaside, and Peninsula, pretty much breaks down with the 5 supervisorial districts. If you look at the whole total of the county, there's 2-to-1 support for this. And you have places like North County and Salinas, and this would include Watsonville too. I'm certain, as you're seeing 75, 80% of the people in favor of this. It's just unimaginable. But again, it was a different time. People were looking at jobs. They saw an opportunity of what this could bring for school districts on funding, a lot of things. South Monterey County, heavily agriculture, still very strongly in favor of it. Although there's a significant amount of people who were uncertain, and that would really play out really poorly for one supervisor down there. Seaside, it was much closer, but still very strongly in favor. And then the Monterey Peninsula, which really Monterey and Pebble Beach area, was very strongly against it over there, and really became the initial center of opposition. I should say that, as I mentioned, my father was on the board of supervisors at that time. And when he had run in 1964, he had promised that he would, if in controversial issues come up, he'd do his own survey and respect the will of the people on this. He did a survey. The notes we still have, and they mirror in North County what Humble Oil has done here. So I believe Humble's survey is very accurate. So as we start this, we could really break this whole controversy down into about four major parts. The first part is the February 15th up until the Monterey County Planning Commission comes to a decision on July 28th. What's important to look at into there is that there's just a lot of different issues that are conflicting. I mean, the Herald and this Monterey Peninsula Herald and the Salinas California is very pro-Humble. The Monterey Peninsula Herald is very much against it. They clashed very bitterly. The Sentinel joined in with the Herald. The Paronian joined in with the Californian. Although I got to say, the Paronian was probably the most unbiased newspaper of all of them, and actually would change its position towards the end. There were other issues that rose up. At the time that Humble came in, they made the claim saying, we can meet your local standards on pollution. Won't be no problem. The only thing is, Monterey County had no air pollution laws. Some cities did, but Monterey County did not. So it was a pretty easy thing to meet onto there. And the regional air pollution control district that we now have, it started because of Humble Oil. At that time, a county or a region could not establish an air pollution control district unless there was air pollution. But Fred Farr, who was the father, who was a state senator at the time, and the father of former Congressman Sam Farr, pushed through legislation that allowed counties in California to establish these districts before air pollution becomes a problem. So you had a lot of these issues coming into there, and initially things were fairly quiet, but opposition started to build on the Monterey Peninsula. But the first sign of opposition actually came in Santa Cruz County. And I'm going to have Kathy read a little bit from the book.
Now I have to find that part.
While you're finding it, I'll just kind of follow up. The opposition on the Monterey Peninsula was really very interesting in itself. A group called Citizens for Clean Air developed. There were three prominent people in there. A fellow by the name of Charles Kramer, who was a retired industrialist. A fellow by the name of Gus Bauman, another retired industrialist. And another fellow named Earl Moser, a retired oil executive from Chevron. All these three guys, you got to be sure, were building factories before they retired around the country. But when this happened here, what's going on here, they suddenly saw that this is not something they wanted. Now, it gives a little NIMBYism and a little image of being hypocrites out of here. But I got to say, I don't know about Bauman, what happened with him. But Moser and Kramer actually became very strong environmentalists. Moser has a trail named after him at one of the Monterey County parks by Monterey and Jack's Peak. Kramer went onto the Coast Commission. So it's a little interesting side there, but I'll let Kathy read here now.
So one of the things that happened when Humble first started pitching its idea for a refinery locally is that it was making all these rather far-fetched promises like that they could build a refinery that had undetectable emissions and that it would smell sweet. So anyway, so that leads into what I'm going to be reading. Humble had a promise for every concern and a grandiose plan as well. The refinery would use only about a quarter of the site, leaving plenty of room for expansion. The too good to be true claims of undetectable emissions, discharged wastewater in which fish thrived, and water that was cleaner than nature's own probably helped insert seeds of doubt into the minds of some. Humble appeared to be open and above board, promising benefits to the economy and the environment while being a good neighbor. However, these claims were dubious at best, coupled with the secretive way in which Humble acquired the Moss Landing site, suggested that the oil officials' words were more of a public relations ploy than reality. While doubts were rising in the minds of Monterey Peninsula residents and to a lesser extent in the rest of Monterey County, it was neighboring Santa Cruz County where the first opposition would gain public notice. Around March 10th, the Santa Cruz County Planning Commission took the unusual step of sending a letter to the Monterey County Planning Commission expressing its interest and concern about pollution from the Humble refinery. The bitterness that would arise over the next few months in the Monterey Bay area played out in that contentious Planning Commission meeting. Commissioners had concerns about air pollution, oil spills, and polluted beaches. On the other side were those who felt the future needed new business to continue the expansion of the post-war economy. Although the vote was unanimous, Commissioner Bruce G. Wolpert's words represented the thoughts of many who felt this was the best use of land. That area has a natural deep water port. It was meant for heavy industry. Commissioner Earl Byer warned of tankers blowing out their bunkers and dumping thousands of barrels of oil into the bay. Fellow Commissioner Elaine Reynolds warned of broken pipelines. Nonsense, Wolpert stated, dismissing those fears without hesitation. Pipelines don't break. I'm on this commission to protect the interests of industry, Wolpert emphasized, and its contributions to the economy of the county, and to heck with beauty. The refinery site was not even in Wolpert's county of Santa Cruz. Nevertheless, Wolpert and others from the pro-business, pro-job side saw a watershed coming. If Humble comes, so will more industry. If Humble is scared away, other industries would never come. Humble would be the third industrial giant in Moss Landing, along with PG&E and Kaiser Refractories. The long-planned Moss Landing Industrial Center was starting to take shape. With Humble, the gates to development might finally be pried open permanently. In an editorial the day after Humble's announcement, the Watsonville Register Paparonians noted, what Humble thinks it may do at Moss Landing, and it's going to spend a cool $1 million just to study the site it's bought, is going to have some effect on the development of the harbor area, long designated as a proper site here for heavy industry. Industry begets industry, and if there ensues a Moss Landing triumvirate of PG&E, Kaiser, and Humble, others will certainly follow.
So here is a little bit of Humble's PR efforts. You know, they put out newspaper ads about how they were pledging to be a good neighbor. And one of them that was very interesting was this little goldfish they had, Yvette. That was in one of their, I guess it was their Baton Rouge refinery. And over there, they had Yvette swim around the water, I guess, kind of like a canary in a coal mine. And as long as Yvette was fine, everything was good. And they always said Yvette was just swimming along happily. So the water discharged from the oil refinery must be just wonderful stuff. One of the big concerns was, we put this refinery in here, then there's going to be a lot of more industry. And one of the pieces of information I was able to gather from my father's files was what Citizens for Clean Air produced, these 10 papers, or these blue papers actually, that listed various concerns that were presented to the Board of Supervisors right before this critical September 2nd, 1965 supervisors meeting, which was the initial vote on it. And as you look at this map that's presented by one, that you have you can see there's 5 refineries up here in the Richmond area, Martinez area. But for every refinery comes in, there's other factories that come in, petroleum byproducts. There's 5 refineries and 21 petroleum byproducts, 33 chemical factories. It becomes a magnet for industry to bring in all these byproducts. And so the opposition opposing Humble saw this as you could not contain it, even though some of those who were backing Humble were taking that position. So I should have jumped back right before I get into this. On this, the Planning Commission had met on July 28th, and was initially, when it was presented to them, it was felt this was going to fly right through. Humble expected it was going to have its permit by April, actually, but it took until July for the Planning Commission to decide on it. And the Planning Commission rejected it on a 5-4 vote, which just shocked everybody. The swing vote on it was a fellow in the name of Peter Kailoto, who was a hardware store owner in Salinas. Kailoto was the only holdover from the 1956 Planning Commission. Kailoto went through and initially supported it, but then when it came to a vote, declared he was going to vote against it. He voted against it and was castigated by the community. His hardware store was boycotted. The Californian attacked him, and it would be many years before many people would speak to him. What happened to him, and you got to realize Salinas was 75% in favor of this proposal. What happened to him surely had an impression on the supervisors. So I want to just touch upon these 5 supervisors a little bit. Although our book has just a lot of characters going through it, we even have a little diagram in there so you can place everybody out. But I want to just give a little background on these 5. This fellow Harold Henry was the most pro-Humble person on there. Henry jumped in real quickly. He represented agriculture. He was very strongly in support of it. What started to happen, though, is that agriculture started to turn. A fellow from Dave Williams from the Bruce Church, which was a big grower back then and no relation to me or my dad, actually started to speak out against it. He was from this guy, Dave Williams, who was who was a farm superintendent, had grown up in LA. He had seen how LA had been destroyed by pollution, and he started to turn to many people in agriculture who had been somewhat ambivalent against it. So agriculture ended up being very split, and Henry was caught in a vice. Art Atteridge had been the former mayor of Salinas and was a supervisor in there. He was really a person that played a big role in establishing the modern town of Salinas. The population doubled during his time, and a lot of development. But again, he was in a very difficult position too, and actually would take a strong environmental positions later, including against the drilling in the Monterey Bay area. But he had his constituents represent. The third supervisor, who was elected and took office in January '65, was, as you see him here with Truman, was Andy Anderson. Anderson had a Congressional Medal of Honor winner from World War II, man of just tremendous courage. He was the only supervisor who voted against the wishes of his constituents. And I should say he did not finish out his term. There was my father on there, who was undoubtedly the most involved of the supervisors. It was his district. He had just come in. He went to, the supervisors traveled from Los Angeles to Washington State, looking at refineries. He went to every one of those and played the biggest role in establishing the conditions onto this permit, with a big chunk of help from Art Atteridge. But Tom Hudson is probably the most important person in stopping Humble oil. He had strong support in this district, which was the Monterey Peninsula. Hudson is also probably one of the most flamboyant politicians to ever be in the Monterey Bay area. He was he rode his horse into the office of the Monterey Peninsula Herald one time. He was known to bike up Carmel Hill. To get attention in some meeting once, he pulled out some pistols, had blanks in it, and fired it up in into the ceiling. That was at a Kiwanis or Rotary Club meeting. But while Hudson was extremely, Hudson was a Republican too. He was but he had very strong conservationist leanings. And while he was very outspoken against Humble, we don't know what he did. He did a lot of things under the table and putting pressure on Humble and it's an amazing story in itself. It probably needed a book written on. So we come to this September of '65, which was the Humble controversy would go on for another 9 months. But in September '65, it came to a head before the Board of Supervisors. On a 3-2 vote on this first one here with the red lettering, Humble it's a 17.5-hour Board of Supervisors meeting. It went from 10 a.m. one morning to 3 a.m. the next morning. They voted in principle to approve Humble 3-2. But they said, we'll take up a discussion on the conditions in a few weeks. In those few weeks, a lot of things happened. A petition drive came up in the Monterey Peninsula, and 12,500 signatures were gathered in 5.5 days to put this on the ballot to a vote. Unfortunately, there was a problem. It wasn't legal. The petition was to rescind the permit, but the permit hadn't been granted because the conditions hadn't been granted. So the petition wasn't accepted, and a fellow by the name of Bill Burley, who had just become the city attorney, a young man at that time, and city attorney in Carmel, then led a lawsuit that would go on to start in the fall. Burley would also go on to become a judge in Monterey County. What then would go on is another really long meeting that would go till about midnight on these conditions. And the important thing to look at up here is the curbs is on this part. So you'll say curbs on refinery 1239. Monterey County, which 6 months earlier had no conditions on nothing down to handle, to really handle a big industry and had nothing on pollution, came up with 39 conditions. Granted this permit to Humble on a 3-2 vote. Again, it's the people who voted against the conditions were the two supervisors who voted against Humble Oil, Hudson and Anderson. Humble came out of this meeting, and it's kind of shaking their head. They're saying, "We've never seen conditions like this. This is a worldwide oil company," and they are quoted as saying, "These are the strictest conditions we know of." Monterey County in 6 months went from nothing to the strictest standards on an oil refinery in the world, and basically set a template for any other conditions that would be coming forth here on heavy industry. And I should say, after Humble, no heavy industry ever wanted to come into Monterey County again. So what's significant about this is, as I mentioned, Storm King Mountain earlier, which set really the basis for environmental law. Monterey County really set the basis for regulatory law on new environmental law onto this. And so many of these were just unique in its nature. I mean, Monterey County dwarfed the San Francisco and Los Angeles in its conditions of what it would require on industry.
Glenn, a question for you comes to mind. So as we think about these strict environmental conditions and how they went from 0 to full steam ahead in 6 months, do you think that was at all influenced by those 3 people that you had mentioned earlier who had worked in industry or in oil refineries? Like, do you think that they had an insight into what was happening or what Humble wanted to do with the potential long-term impact or their ability to deliver on their promises? Do you think that influenced any types of these conditions whatsoever?
Yeah, to tell you the truth, I'm sure that they did have an impact onto there, because they played a big role in speaking about these conditions, especially Earl Moser, who was a retired oil executive. He got into one squabble with representatives from Humble because he could speak their language. and you could challenge them. So I'm sure this had a big impact, but actually Monterey County was already putting some of these together in March, which sort of delayed it. There had been a meeting down or a trip down to Los Angeles, and Monterey County came back with 16 conditions it took from Los Angeles, which was some of the strictest in the world at that point. So, and actually these three fellows, and this is what makes it really, really interesting on why we take the argument saying that some of the people that were very, very pro-Humble, and some of the farmers were. For example, Bud Antle, a big grower down there, they were on the opposite side of Bruce Church. They were taking the position, yeah, we want Humble in there, but we want it to be strictly controlled. One of the planning commissioners voted for it, a fellow from Elkhorn area named Daniel Christian. He was strongly in favor of Humble oil, but he said, we have to put controls on it. And as my father would always say to me, is that the people in this district wanted the oil refinery, but they wanted strict controls. So it was really more than what those three were doing. I never did find anything outside of maybe Moser that had an impact onto those. And when it came down to the conditions, so they weren't the ones really arguing before the Board of Supervisors. They were still arguing, let's stop the whole thing dead in its track. It was actually there that you had agriculture, which had been so bitterly divided, actually pulled together. Those that had been pro and anti-Humble, and argued before the Board of Supervisors that we want to have limits on this. And it was agriculture which actually publicly presented for the first time one of the very key and very important conditions on there. And that was, let me just take a step back here. You see, a 50,000 barrel oil refinery is not just limited to 50,000 barrels. The supervisors, a few days before their meeting, made a trip to Anacortes, Washington, where they learned that an oil refinery can actually produce, like 50,000 barrel oil refinery could actually produce 80,000 barrels. So the Board of Supervisors said, no, we're putting a limit on this. You can't produce more than 65,000 barrels. And if you want to expand, you have to come back and get a full new permit. They would have to start the whole process over again. And that would play a really important role. So anyway, just want to kind of hit this third part here a little bit. Is a smog district, and during this period towards the end, it was created at that point. It only involved Monterey County at that time. It didn't include Santa Cruz County. Santa Cruz County wanted to jump in, but Monterey County wanted to do it on its own initially. There was this legal battles going on, as I mentioned, with Bill Burley. Burley would keep losing these battles, although the judge would say, well, that's a pretty creative argument you have there, Mr. Burley, but it's not going to fly. But he would keep nipping at the heels of Humble. And then you had this group that was, those three gentlemen we talked about, and this group, Citizens for Clean Air, morphed into another one. Few other people emerged, and they started to do a massive public education campaign. So there was all these forces that play in there, and that's really what was really came down as being important. And finally, what came down is on May 18th, Humble finally just threw up its hands. It had a permit for 9 months. It wouldn't build. Why wouldn't it build? Well, it had Burley pursuing them. He's doing appeals. You had this coordinated effort that had gone from the Monterey Peninsula to the Salinas Valley, where ag was drawn in, that had it was just constantly opposing this and actually going national in their opposition. And then you had these 39 conditions, and Humble, shortly before it was to pull out, was already making sounding saying, 50,000 barrels isn't going to do it right now. We need a 100,000 barrel refinery. So I just want to have Kathy read one little bit here as we end. It's a editorial from the Watsonville Register of Pargonian as this affair came to an end.
The opponents, to be sure, were most vocal on the Monterey Peninsula at a considerable distance from Moss Landing. If the refinery should be overly smelly, it hardly would have offended the nostrils of the denizens of Pebble Beach. If it should pollute the air, the damage would be to the Salinas and Pajaro valleys and not to the 16th Green at Cypress Point. Only water pollution, if it should occur from spillage from tankers, would have been a direct hazard to the people who made the most noise. These people, however, may well have done a favor for the people of the Salinas and Pajaro valleys, sometimes referred to as the last remaining clean air shed in coastal California. At the very least, they caused the creation of air pollution control machinery. Further, they and some of the people engaged in agriculture hereabouts have alerted us all to the care we must use in giving use permits to industries. Moss Landing is designated on Monterey County's master plan as a site for heavy industry. It is a proper site for such use with rail and highway connections in a port. Pacific Gas and Electric and Kaiser are already located there, and it would be folly for conservationists, however well-intentioned, to contend that Elkhorn Slough should be maintained as a permanent bird refuge. But as Humble's opponents pointed out, there's something special about oil refineries. They can't help smelling like refineries, and only with the greatest care can they be designed to avoid putting pollutants into the air and spilling crude oil into the water. Clean water is essential to the recreational functions of the Monterey Bay. Clean air is vital to agriculture, our basic industry.
So pretty much concludes our presentation here, and we'd be very happy to take any questions that anybody has in here. It's
Yeah.
as I said, it's a multi-layered issue here.
It sounds like a very fascinating intertwined story. And we do have one question here. This is from Linda. She wants to know, was David Packard involved in this? His family owned much of the land around the railroad.
I don't recall seeing anything with Packard. There were a number of prominent names that would pop up, like Westinghouse, I think was one. Wasn't one there? I think it was in the bottom, because the Pebble Beach area had quite a few people that were pretty prominent names, but I don't remember David Packard's name at all coming up.
Okay, thank you. At this point too, I'd like to invite our participants, if you have a question, you can either type it into the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask the question directly. I want to thank you for giving such a wonderful overview of a very complex story. You did a great job of weaving all these intricacies into a 45-minute chat. So thank you for that. And with that, I will open the floor to anyone that might have questions. Oh, we have a comment here from Carol who says, thank you, we bought your book. And yeah, I was just looking it up as well. Definitely piqued my interest.
If you're in the Watsonville area, you can get it from Kelly's Books. If you're up in Santa Cruz, Bookshop Santa Cruz has it. If you're in the Peninsula or Salinas, the bookstores over there have it. So it's around all locally. You can order through us online too. And I should say, if you do order from us online, and you put in the code either www where it says nonprofit donation or Watsonville Wetlands Watch, we will send 25% of those proceeds donated to the watch.
Thank you for that. Great. And someone here, Scott, has another comment. He said, I heard that John Steinbeck was involved. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, I don't think we ever found anything about Steinbeck. Now, one of the famous people who was involved was Ansel Adams, the photographer.
Mm-hmm.
And he got, he lived in the Carmel Highlands at the time, and he wrote very eloquent, long letters to the editor of the Herald, talking about, that this was something that could not happen.
Adams was really the moral voice of the opposition. Steinbeck, I was looking around for that. I did much of the research with the newspapers, most of that, and Steinbeck actually, I don't remember if it was the Herald or the California now, which one it was, but he had a column he was writing there at that time, and I kept looking. I go, wow, I'd like to see if he took a position on this. So, boy, if somebody has information on that, would love to see it.
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. I think one question I have is like, what did you learn through this process that kind of surprised you the most? Was there any unexpected twist that just left you like, oh, aghast or a gasp? If so, what was that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think
There were a lot of
You want to go
things.
first, Kathy?
Well, I think this whole thing with the Moss Landing Area Development Plan, when we found out the extent of that, that was shocking. I mean, that people had intended for Moss Landing to become this enormous port with all this heavy industry. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like there today to have, all these smokestacks and huge buildings and
Yes.
belching smoke, and I cannot even imagine what it would be like. It certainly wouldn't be what it is today.
For me, one, it was to see the significance, the national scope of this, and that something as this important has been somewhat forgotten. So in looking through, and I got to say, it's so multi-layered. One of the people who were the readers in our book was reading through it and saying, "Well, this thing reads like a Russian novel because there's characters coming in and out." And so that's where we had to kind of put in a cast of characters early because there's so many people in there. And we could have kept it really short, but we felt there was really something that it had to be laid out here in detail because this really documents not just really environmental activism at its earliest stage, but certain political activism and how laws are made. It has really a lot of significance out of there. For me, there was a lot of a personal knowledge I learned out of there. I had these things my dad told me in his notes, and then towards the end, one of the shocking things I found out is something an action he took at the very end, which I'll just kind of leave if anybody ever gets that part in the book. That was played a really big role, and he never told me about that. So there was just a great learning experience.
Yeah, it sounds
so
like
there was a question that popped up from Carol, and now it's gone away.
I can see it. It says, isn't there a current development plan for Moss Landing that might bring some significant changes?
Well, the plan, that original Moss Landing area development plan, it stayed in place up until the 70s. And I know there were some efforts by the Moss Landing Harbor District in the early 1970s to say, hey, we got to get this thing going again because nobody's coming. And there was, at that point, there was a squabble with my father over that because he actually would go on to be one of the founding members of the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, which is a very interesting shift from somebody who initially had, when you look at his first vote to there, but I think it's pretty much aligned with his whole views throughout this whole time. But the plan developed in in that mid 1970s, it started to shift, and it's been several since then. So what the current one is, I've seen it, and I know it's a lot more on tourism and not too much on the industry, although we have the Tesla over there by PG&E, and there's actually talk of even now of a desal plant not too far from there. That proposal that just came up. So there is still some heavy industry component.
Thank you for answering that. I just want to share with you one comment from that's been kind of echoed by several people in our chat here. And this is a great presentation on our local history. And then someone else said, Cindy said, thank you so much. This is a subject I knew nothing about and is an amazing story. Great presentation. So
thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful peek at such an interesting story that has somehow gotten put by history's wayside, and for bringing that back up to our attention. It's very captivating indeed. And with this, I think I'll turn it over to Noelle to see if she has any last minute questions for you today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm blown away by this amount of history and the really far-reaching impacts that the history our community has had on really the environmental history of our nation. So thank you. This was really amazing. And I'm so happy that you both took this interest and passion and wrote this book and shared it with everyone, and then came tonight and shared it with all of us in person. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say is we really felt, that it's a piece of history that shouldn't be forgotten because people fought so hard, you know, for this and for the beauty that we now really take for granted. And, you know, the moral of the story is you cannot take it for granted. You have to keep fighting, you know, and I'm sure you know that all too well, you know, in your work with Wetlands Watch. So we got to keep fighting the good fight.
Right, and it's nice to see too that the trust we can have in our elected officials and in our local government to even if it seems like the odds are stacked against something coming through, but having the will of the people shown through in our legislation and in our democratic process is very refreshing, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, thank you both so much for coming out, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Thank you for taking time out of your evening to watch this wonderful presentation. I would be remiss if I didn't let you all know that, sorry, I just got a text from my mother saying she was one of the high schoolers at that time who was writing in these petitions to stop this from happening. So she was very excited. She loved your talk, but I want to say thank you to everyone who came. I would be remiss if I didn't let you all know that a month from today, exactly on March 9th, we are going to have another Zoom virtual speaker series, this time with Joe Burnett from Ventana Wildlife. He is the coordinator for condor restoration efforts, and he is going to come and to give us an update on everything that's happening with their efforts to save the condor, and even more potentially interesting updates after the most recent fire. So he's going to be here on the 9th. We're going to have that up on our website starting tomorrow for folks to register for that one. And yeah, again, thank you so much, Glenn and McKenzie, for coming and talking to us about this very interesting story.
Absolutely. Yeah, glad to do it. All right.
Wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
So much,
Thanks,
everyone.
everybody.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.